So I'm gonna give kind of a casual version of a talk that I did at the Socialism Conference a couple of weeks ago, and that will eventually be in a more formal way, an article that people can read and stuff. But talking about smashing the state, I think whole libraries are filled with cataloging the unending violence and the racism and terror that's the everyday operating procedure of the US state. And like on that basis alone, I think any socialist, any individual who has a dream of a world free of this violence should relish the idea of abolishing this edifice with all its death-making institutions and smashing the state. Um, but I think, unfortunately, it's not that intuitive. I think there's a lot of reasons for that I'll go over. But what I want to argue is that this kind of pithy little slogan, smashing the state, is actually a core element of the project of winning socialism and essential for ending the despotic order of global racist capitalists. There's a whole bunch of immediate tactical and strategic debates in our movement about what reforms we fight for, how we fight for it, what's our relationship to elections, the Democratic Party, dirty break or not dirty break or blah, 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 how we organize, reform and revolution. And I think that really in the socialist movement, if you dig enough, the question of the state is really there at the center of each of those. So sometimes I think we kind of argue around the peripheries and not cut to what I think is the heart of the matter. And that is, what is the understanding of and orientation to the capitalist state by socialists? I think it's very under theorized for reasons that I'm not sure of, but I think that we want to sort of think about is how we are able to combine our theorizing of our immediate practical tasks, what we're doing in the right now, with that of various big picture questions like socialist revolution, because our goal isn't just winning the wage increase, the eviction moratorium, or closing this or that prison, but a radical reconstruction of all of society. Our project is as big a picture as one can imagine. As the poem goes, to our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth. And so in a quick little 30 minutes, I want to kind of just do three things. I want to describe what the state is, giving kind of a Marxist analysis, talking about the notion and phrase of smashing the state and what I think that looks like. And then talking a little bit about some counter arguments that are sometimes made by socialists, actually quite often in the US socialist movement, that is a counter argument to the notion of smashing the state, that argues that the road to socialism must proceed through taking claim of the state via electoral means, and this sort of stuff. So I want to sort of take those three things on in the course of the talk. So first, what is a state? So a state is an organized body of people who are charged with a monopoly on certain crucial social functions, making and enforcing through so-called legitimate violence rules. It's a combination of a bureaucracy, so all the departments, State Department, Treasury, Interior, Congress, local bodies, and that of armed force, Army, FBI, CIA, Border Patrol, local police. And in most capitalist states, a minute speck of these individuals are elected. Though, of course, the ones who are elected do play a role making adjustments to the course, though the destination per se is inbuilt into what the state is, I think. The modern capitalist state, as described in a famous line from the Communist Manifesto, is, quote, but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So managing those affairs means ensuring the smooth functioning of capitalism for the capitalist class of any given country, internationally too, but countries, states, nations are an important building block. And the core of this management of capitalist order is a, quote, special body of armed men, to use another oft quoted phrase of Lenin. So these two elements, the monopoly of threat of overwhelming violence and the manager of capitalist interest, is the operating principles of the capitalist state in general. So it kind of does those two things. I'm going to talk about these briefly in turn. First, in thinking about this committee for common capitalist interests, it's important to note this committee is not a literal committee of ruling capitalists. I say this without minimizing the massive influence the capitalist class exerts via ways that people know, system runs on campaign contributions, lobbying, revolving doors of actual members of the ruling class who serve as state managers, etc. But even with that, it can't be said that the state is a simple tool or instrument that is immediately directed by billionaires, with their top hats and twirly mustaches, sitting around a table in a darkened room. So this is what's called the instrumentalist theory of the state. And some crude Marx analysis make this error. The instrumentalist theory, as pointed out by radical sociologist Fred Bloch, misses two key features of the state. So the first is that Even if it is a simple tool that serves class rule, it must appear otherwise. The fact that the bourgeois state appears as a neutral intermediary plays an important ideological function. But secondly, and more importantly, the general interest of capital is not always shared or known by the capitalists themselves. So capitalists as a class are not class conscious. Jeff Bezos, for example, has his best interest in making what is most profitable for his little slice of the pie, and this shapes his inability to know the best interests of the system as a whole. As capitalism is a system driven by processes of exchange on the market, capitalists are in competition with each other. This is the case alongside, of course, they also have strong solidarity that they have when their collective interests are threatened by the working class. So this combination is why Marx and Engels refer to them as a hostile band of brothers. And this is dramatically more the case when you talk about imperialism, which is competition between capitalists of different states. And we can talk about that in the discussion. The states, or state managers specifically, once constituted, develop their own special interests. What makes the capitalist state unique, say from a monarchy, is that, to quote Engels, it stands above society. However, it's important to note that some reformists say that because it stands above society, because there's this relative autonomy, they say, hey, since there are these divisions in a non-class conscious capitalist class, and since the state's not simply their tool, we can grab hold of it and use it for our purposes to carry out a socialist transition. So I'm going to talk about that position later on, but I think that what we want to have a structural analysis because it tells you why the state structurally functions to serve capitalist interests. It's not just who's in control, but it's what it does. States rely on tax revenue and borrowing. That's how they function. That depends on profitability and a business climate that promotes investment. This becomes especially the case during periods of economic crisis. And of course, capitalism is crisis prone, moves in these cycles of boom and bust. So when capitalism is in bust cycle, state managers' job is to work to restart the capitalist economic engine and work to facilitate capitalist investment. This is what largely determines the overall level of economic activity under capitalism. So pro-business decisions, which often carry with it austerity for the working class, are always the solution. Now, this is a simplification, but in a sense, states have to compete for the private decisions of capitalists to maintain themselves. And thus, the structural function of the state is to ensure the smooth, profitable functioning of the capitalist system in general, and specifically to manage a favorable business climate for the interests of the state's specific national capitalist class. That's why capitalism has to have many states. And here I want to gesture again, international competition between states creates a whole nother thing. In the cutthroat world of the market, where capitalists are in competition and competition breeds crisis, something needs to have a degree of independence to facilitate a market order that keeps the business going. And so for the state, maintaining market order, aside from these economic determinations, also essentially requires an organization of violent force. Having that viable business climate for investment means a monopolization of what is considered legitimate violence to be able to ensure that that order is maintained. We see this in many ways. Cops beat the protesters. Mass incarceration is devised to thwart Black rebellion. Tanks roll through the street to quell uprisings. Bombs troops infinite war abroad to maintain hegemony. Police occupation of Black neighborhoods to try to control the symptoms of racist organized neglect. So this special body of armed men fulfill a key social function of the capitalist order. For our purpose, I just want to underscore that this component of the state is its keystone. And so if what I said previously about what drives the state to act in capitalist interest, the thing that enables it to act is this capacity for violence. And this centrality is unchanged, even though since the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin and all those guys, layers have been added to the state. While the contemporary state has way more levels of bureaucracy and complexity than before, and while there even have been iterations of welfare functions that have been added in the post-World War II period due to an anomaly of post-war economic boom, still allowing the state at its core, it still is special bodies of armed men. And I sort of highlight that because some of the folks who advocate taking control of the state, well, the nature of it has changed because it's more complex. But that's an error. And you can look at it very materially. The budgets, which of course come from workers' tax dollars on both the federal and local level, still devote over a third to over a half on armed men. And let's look at the relative sizes. The Department of Labor, for example, has 17,000 employees. The Department of Education has 4,000 employees. In comparison, there are 12,000 congressional lobbyists. The size of the entire non-military federal workforce is 2 million. However, 35% of that 2 million are civilians working for the Department of Defense. The military numbers 1.4 million individuals. Indeed, the DoD is the largest employer in the world, and local police forces often make up this huge component of the municipal state. In Chicago here, 40% of City of Chicago employees are cops. So purely from the stance of raw numbers, the special body of armed men description still figures centrally, and is this murderous leviathan that's reason for being is to be deployed to institute capitalist order and defend the state and private property. So the state structurally plays this role of instituting and maintaining capitalist order, attempting to generalize the working of the capitalist system, and wielding this monopoly of violent force to ensure its rule remains. So it's not a neutral tool, but a special organization that historically was developed for one sole purpose. And so now let's talk about the smashing part. So the phrase "to smash the state" probably was popularized by Lenin in State and Revolution, but comes from Marx and the lessons that he and Engels gleaned from the Paris Commune. Things y'all probably know, but in 1871, in the midst of a massive political crisis and war, the workers of Paris rose up and took control of the city and engaged in an experiment of democratic self-rule for roughly 3 months. As the events of Paris were unfolding, Marx, in a letter to a comrade, wrote that he learned that it was, quote, essential for real people's revolution was, quote, not to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. The German word he uses is zerbrechen, which means to break apart completely. So the lesson of the Commune would figure into 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto, where they said that the one thing they needed to update about the manifesto was that, quote, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Marx, who also wrote that the most useful thing the state could do would be to commit suicide, and Engels, who opined that he looked forward to the day when the state would sit in the Museum of Antiquity next to other useless tools. Both were quite clear that the transformation of a socialist society would require a revolution against the state with the goal of abolition. So why? So there's a couple of reasons rooted in the fact that socialism, for each according to their needs and by each according to their ability, is a democratic project. Indeed, I'd argue it's the only possible actual way that we can have democracy. Instituting our democratic determination over our world, our labor, and the fruits thereof require a completely different kind of social organization. The capitalist state in the form of bourgeois democracy, which is the form in most of the dominant capitalist countries, was considered by Marx and company as the most stable form of government for capitalism, precisely because of this illusion of democratic control. Straight up military dictatorships are firstly expensive to maintain and historically are notoriously brittle, as there's little ideological cover that can serve as a buffer of class anger against state violence and inequality. But to quote Lenin, bourgeois democracy, although a great historical advance in comparison with medievalism, always remains, and under capitalism is bound to remain, restricted, truncated, false, and hypocritical, a paradise for the rich and a snare and deception for the exploited. So the fact that it's more democratic than feudalism or dictatorship doesn't mean that the democracy afforded can deliver liberation, hence the snare. So under bourgeois democracy, politics is like completely divorced from daily life. We, of course, have the right to vote, or at least some of us do, in federal and local races, but we do so in an atomized form. We do it in isolation from any community, via secret ballot. In most cases, are disconnected from political discussion or actual collective decision-making. And of course, even this vote, if you can do it, is rigged via voter disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, money in politics, restrictions to the two-party system, electoral college, and the list goes on and on and on. Then after you vote someone to office, we have no real mandate over their activity. On the federal level, there's no way to recall someone and exert control. And the notion of holding politicians accountable that we hear sometimes in the movement, I think is asinine and insulting hot air. Like, you shouldn't have to pressure someone to do the thing that you voted for them to do. Then the majority of elections are for legislature, which handles the general case of laws, while the business of states is very concerned with generalities and specifics. So all the details of what the state managers, the different departments do, is very divorced from what any of us have to say about what education should look like, or all these numerous summits that are convened all around the world that make these major international decisions about war, economics, and crucially, climate catastrophe. So all the G8, 9, 10, 11, 12 meetings make giant decisions and have massive ramifications for working people. We have no say of that. On top of that, the vast majority of the state is not elected, and we have next to no control, importantly, over the repressive apparatuses of the army and the police. So lastly, and I think this is actually most importantly, in the place where we spend the majority of our waking time at work, we have absolutely no democracy. We have no control over our workplaces, though maybe if we're lucky enough to be in a union that's not shit, we can negotiate over the terms of exploitation. So this Gordian knot is a product of the state's function, which I described earlier. It's not that the state is a manifestation of the will of the people, as liberals articulate, but as a special organization floating above society designed to instill market order, generalize capitalist interest, manage class antagonism, and diffuse it if possible, crush resistance if not. And as we know from the story of the Gordian knot, we don't untie it, we have to slice it in half to break it apart completely, zerbrechen. But the breaking apart of the state is one that is not purely a destructive act. So abolition, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us, is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. We get to these life-affirming institutions by replacing the state with its charade of representative democracy with organs of direct democracy and self-government. This is why the state is a hurdle to the creative act of socialist transformation. The state maintains its rule and its place above society and its use of violence to secure that place and maintain capitalist order. Self-government is the antithesis of that. The Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky wrote that the most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. The entry of masses of people into their own self-government means breaking apart the channels that previously was all about constraining choice, self-determination, and divorcing politics and choice from the daily life of everybody. The direct control from below looks very different than a repurposing of the current state. The bourgeois state is premised on divorcing power and politics from the masses. We want to bring all power to the masses. We don't want the right people in the Department of Education. We want teachers in democratic control of their schools. We don't want union-friendly bureaucrats in control of the Department of Labor. We want worker control of production. We don't control the police. We want them abolished. Jails leveled, borders opened. This may seem like a chaotic process, but it's actually one that requires a great deal of organization and combativity of our class, and that's precisely why the action of breaking apart is a tremendously creative one. And to be clear, no one's saying smash the public schools or abolish the post office or tear up the roads and Social Security, but we're saying that these things and the rest of society have to be freed from the old state. And by doing that, they receive a greater breath of life directly being connected to the power of self-management. And then we see a snippet of this creativity of struggle when we see protest tactics and organizational forms, how they're created on the fly. We see it in the mutual aid that sprung up during the pandemic, the protest waves that surge forward. We want the councils and assemblies that can bloom in public life during mass struggle to be the form of public life that manages society. And so to truly be able to carry this through, this level of creativity and struggle actually then has to be organized on a massive scale to create a power that can take over the organization of society from below. So that situation is often called dual power. We can talk about that in the discussion. Well, we aren't there yet. This is why there's kind of a degree of abstraction to the talk. I think that we must be clear that our side taking power of our lives back from below will always be up against the state. When the ill-gotten gains of the rulers who own everything while doing nothing is challenged, we can't be naive that they're going to just roll over and give in. Revolution is required and necessary, and the state in the end will be a hurdle, and its abolition the precondition for enacting a socialist transition from below. And in this talk, I don't actually talk too much about socialist transition because I think people go there quickly as opposed to getting at the core element of what is the state and why it has to go away. And I think that piece is the thing that particularly in the debates in the socialist left now, people skip over. But I think it's a worthy discussion to have about transition and withering and that sort of thing. So in my last 10 minutes, I want to talk about the other argument. So the argument that people make against the idea that we need to smash the state. And so there's some folks in the socialist movement who see contra Marx that we should simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it to our purposes. So I'm going to briefly lay out what the arguments are. I'm going to try to, actually say what they say, and then go through some common arguments they make against the conception of state abolition that I laid out. So the common sense, the position they lay out is what I would call utopian incrementalism. And that is the construction of socialism by basically the following. First, You build movements for reforms with broad appeal on the idea that we're building broad support for socialism. Usually these reforms are designed around some kind of legislation, often written by an NGO or lobbyist organization to try to get it passed through Congress. So the best versions of this position are clear that they want to build a mass movement. But the mass movement, the self-activity of people in struggle, is just seen as a pressure tool that applies pressure through demonstrations and the like to get the legislation passed. They actually don't make any decisions. The point of this mass movement pressure campaign is then also utilized to get socialist politicians elected, and advocates of this position see getting them elected as the real win and gains of the movement. So shortcuts like running them in capitalist political parties are often utilized. So the goal being to incrementally accumulate electoral victories in order to win a majority in Congress. Then the socialist movement perhaps can try to make some moves to nationalize key industries. The worst of these positions believes this fantasy story that then will like pass socialist laws that change the institutional structure of capitalism. And then out of respect for the legality of the state, the army and the police remain loyal to the socialist-run state. The capitalists are outfoxed, and by our clever strategy, voila, we have something that's called socialism, but usually they're just fine with some kind of nationalization. So this is pure reformism, in that it believes that the capitalist mode of production can be fixed from within. But there's a more savvy version of this position that's articulated by someone like Karl Kautsky, the early 20th century German socialist, and repeated by those today who fairly dogmatically hold these same positions. They have some acknowledgement there'll be some kind of attempt by the capitalist class to stop this hypothetical socialist majority government. People like Kautsky sometimes allude to it by talking about some final test of strength that presumably is like a mass defense of a capitalist-led coup of this hypothetical socialist majority government. The problem being is it's always ill-defined. What are you talking about? It's test of strength. Revolution is not on the agenda anytime soon, so they say, let's not talk about it. And Vivek Chibber literally said that. So there's two main critiques of this position. The first is on its gradualism, and the second is on the question of revolution. The structure of the state, relying on taxes and investment, as I described before, means that the question of crisis figures into the struggle for reforms. Like when capitalism is booming, reforms are easier to apply. When capitalism is in economic downturn, then that places immense pressure on the rolling back of reforms in order to attempt to stimulate capitalist investment. So this puts this hypothetical majority socialist government in a tremendous bind. Like, do they restrain and demobilize their supporters' hopes and demands as they strike and protest to preserve what's being taken away? Or does this government promote further radicalization and thus provoke direct confrontation with the capitalist class? So firstly, the track record on this type of experiment always lends towards the former, of restraining people's hopes. Past attempts have always taken the restraint option, and as direct confrontation would entail rupture of the state. Then the question of smashing the state actually comes on the table. And there's a lot of different examples of this we could talk through. France in 36, Chile in 1973, France in 1981, Greece in 2015, and people love to talk about Sweden as the ideal for some, which from 1932 to 1976 had a left-wing socialist government, the Social Democratic Workers' Party, SAP, and a left majority in parliament for all but 9 years, from 1932 to 2006. The Swedish working class went on strike more than any other European country, so much so that for the rest of Europe, to have the Swedish disease meant that workers struck too much. But by 1975, the tentative balance the SAP had created with the employers began to lean more in the employers' direction, and SAP lost power. In the 80s and 90s, conditions were downgraded, nationalizations went down, and then we saw in the fall of 2018, a neo-Nazi party, the Swedish Democrats, emerge in national elections, and in an election that was just 2 weeks ago, they won 20% of the vote, and now the second largest party in government. And so it doesn't sort of turn out so well. So in short, this dilemma that's faced in this hypothetical situation, to quote British socialist Ian Birchall, is to challenge the pursuit of profit makes reform impossible. But to leave profit unchallenged means that no significant progress can be made towards equality. So the alternative to this conundrum is to move to upend the capitalist social relation. And that means upending private property. That path is not one that can be carried out within the bounds of legality within the state. The state in the capitalist context relies on capitalist social relations, even if it has a reformist government who seeks to try to redistribute things more equally. But the problem of capitalism is not a problem of distribution, but on the social relation of private property, held by the few, forcing the many to trade their labor on the market in order to not starve. This is why there's a limit to nationalization to the legal courses of the state, and why so many attempts to carry this out is met with either capital flight, capitalists literally take the money and leave, or violent coups in which the state is dissolved or taken over by forces friendlier to the capitalists. So now I'll talk about the question of revolution. So the utopian incrementalists like to sequester the question of revolution as somehow being less relevant question because it's not on the immediate agenda. And so this position is either naive in that it underestimates its eventual crucial importance, or dishonest, in which they actually don't think revolution is possible or desirable. To quote a comrade of mine from Rampant, Tyler Zimmer, who was responding to an article by Vivek Chibber, he said, if a goal like revolution is desirable and feasible in the long run, but impossible to achieve in the short run, and he means like tomorrow, it seems extremely unwise to push it to the side and dismiss it as irrelevant to those organizing in the here and now. And I would add, it's not just unwise, but disastrous, as indeed this final conflict with capital and its shock troops of counter-revolution is the most crucial, difficult, and dangerous challenge. If it's in the struggle that revolutions win or they're repressed by blood. If we're building a socialist movement and an organization of revolutionaries that are unprepared for these moments at the highest level of the class struggle, then we are sure to lose. And that truth has brutal historical lessons in the annals of capitalist revenge for movements, organizations, and governments that, according to the rulers, take a step too far. So now I want to sort of close out by kind of taking up, I think, some of the counter arguments that are often made against the kind of smash the state position from the utopian incrementalists. And in doing so, I also want to describe that these same arguments have been made for a long time. Like in reading the literature, preparing sort of this, the same basic two arguments are always made to bolster their position, from the writings of Kautsky in the early 20th century to the Euro-communists of the 70s and 80s, like Santiago Carrillo and Enrico Berlinguer, and related thinkers to Poulantzas and its contemporary adherents. So while there's not like novelty to these arguments, even though they often present them as we're being the undogmatic realists, you Leninists, you know. So the first is that of the military and the state. So revolution, they argue, is impossible because modern militaries and the repressive apparatuses are far more developed, advanced, and solid than they were 100 years ago at the time of Marx and Lenin and the Russian Revolution. So that's what they say. Now, there's an obvious truth to this, and this is why it would be a massive challenge. I think it'd be delusional to say otherwise. And that's why when I talk about revolution, I don't think that some kind of small armed guerrilla type struggle that immediately pursues a military strategy is something that's effective or anything but suicidal in this country at this moment. The revolution will have to have a mass character involving huge sections of society in the streets, engaging in militant action. And yes, I think there will be armed defense, but its mass quality and connections to be able to shut down society are its main tools. And acknowledging this being a major challenge, I think the idea that this means that revolution is thus unrealistic doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny, because it doesn't present an alternative. Like, it's utopian to believe in the political neutrality of the army. Like, do we actually believe that state bodies like the CIA are going to adhere to the conventions of legality under pressure in a system in crisis and the question of expropriation be on the line? Like, do we believe that the military brass in toto are not going to go over to the force of reaction? Like, we see that in much lesser moments of struggle, with far less on the line for the capitalist class about how the police work in tandem with the far right, and the scores of examples like Kyle Rittenhouse during the 2020 anti-racist rebellion should stand as examples. So the challenge of counter-revolution by forces of reaction is a real one. And the fact that it's harder doesn't answer the question as to how you stop it. Their side says rally to defend the majority socialist government. And even if this were the specific situation, counter-revolution will not be defeated without destroying the means for counter-revolution to be carried out. That means breaking apart the state, the repressive apparatus, seizing the means of production, and that is called socialist revolution. And it cannot be accompanied by any respect for private property or servility to bourgeois legality. So the second charge is that bourgeois democracy has a legitimacy for the vast majority of working people. Parliaments, they argue, are gains won by the working class people and thus should be defended. I think the first thing to say about this is that's a wild historical inaccuracy. Universal suffrage, the right to vote, was a demand and won by the working class, but parliaments were not. Rather, parliaments were designed to secure rule by the bourgeoisie or even implemented as pressure valves from above or fears of rebellion. But that aside, again, the challenge of how we're going to convince people that we need to sort of do this can't be overstated. Like, it's going to be a challenge. But at the same time, I think the idea that there are that there's a lot of hope in the current system doesn't match up. In a Gallup poll from July of this year, they found that the approval rating of Congress was 7%. The same Gallup poll found that the average confidence levels in all political institutions were at a historic low. So the fact that the state can offer some reforms is the basis for modern reformism, but that's a challenge to be overcome, not something to sort of kowtow to. And so I think the question is, what do revolutionaries say in our propaganda and our attitude to the work building movements? Do we stoke support for liberal democracy and the status quo and reinforce the legitimacy of the system that people are already trying to question? Or do we try to fuel the fire of intense dissatisfaction and say, yes, the system is rotten and it cannot save you, it has to be abolished? These are actually two different tasks. And with that, I'm getting near to time. So just to sort of conclude, the capitalist state structurally functions in that it's not a direct instrument of the ruling class, but an apparatus that floats above society that works to generalize the best interests for the maintenance of the capitalist system and promote the interests of the national ruling class. Its core is special bodies of armed men used to enforce the subservience to market order. And lastly, it is not a tool to be used by our side, but a hurdle to be overcome if we want to take democratic control over society, if we want to transform capitalist social relations to building a socialist world. The capitalist state needs to be smashed into smithereens and relegated to the annals of ancient history. That's it.